down, Jesse.
You know that photo of my office there?
Happening now, tens of thousands of auto jobs are on the line. Today is the deadline for GM and Chrysler to submit their recovery plans to the U.S. government. The auto giants are trying to make concession deals with the United Auto Workers Union as part of that restructuring. Here's something to think about today if you're watching the latest viral video on YouTube. Canada's broadcast regulator, that's the CRTC, is looking at the control of online broadcasting. And to explain what this means and how your online activities could be affected, we're joined now by technology expert Jesse Hirsh. Kind of hard to get your mouth around this one, but help me out with what is the central issue.
Well, I think they're twofold. One is literally how much you pay for the internet, because part of the issue here is whether there should be add-on fees that cover things like piracy, that cover things like Canadian content, and whether those fees are passed on to the carriers or to the consumers themselves. But I think a sub-issue here is the relevance of the CRTC, and whether, as a broadcast regulator, it's still relevant within the network era, the sort of post-broadcast era that the internet represents.
And maybe that question arises on the relevance because it's taken so darn long to look at this issue anyway. What, like 10 years or something? Well, Why the delay?
Well, I think part of it has been this myth that the internet is a wide open frontier that you can't regulate. And to some extent, the CRTC has backed away, in part because they've lacked the expertise as a government bureaucracy to keep up with the speed of the internet.
Okay.
It changes so quickly that, you know, what you say 6 months will be obsolete 6 months later. And that, from a cultural perspective, is just not how fast the CRTC works. So this, I think, took them a long time to both have the courage to have this type of debate, but also the types of problems online, like spam, like child pornography, are reaching such a intolerable level that regulation now becomes palatable. It now becomes something we talk about because the threats of the internet are that much more real.
Does regulation have to mean cost to the consumer? Like, do those two go hand in hand?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think a lot of critics against regulation, namely the industry like the ISPs, like Bell and Rogers, start to argue that because they don't want any further regulation.
Sure, they don't want to hit their consumers with it, right? Their customers.
So to some extent, it's a scare tactic. But the reality is the government of Canada does regulate the internet in lots of piecemeal ways. Like the Copyright Board has a levy on blank media to deal with file sharing. And Justice deals with child pornography. And the Competition Bureau deals with ISPs and how much market share there is. And now the government's talking about a rural broadband initiative. So rather than have all these different programs set about, the CRTC, certainly when it came to radio and television, had the mandate to deal with all of these issues in a central way. And really this hearing is addressing that. Can the CRTC address all these concerns? Do they have the legitimacy to deal with these concerns? Or should the internet remain regulated by the private sphere, which means anything goes? Canadian
content, I want to bring that into our discussion because that is, you know, you mentioned that's also an issue. How do you enforce or bring in more Canadian content?
Well, I think the issue is not so much enforcement, but encouragement. That, you know, the internet is a wide open frontier, but I think a lot of artists need support, need encouragement. And there's a lot of companies who would benefit from the type of cultural funding that television and music in general in Canada has benefited from, that we sort of assume that the Canadian nation state is based upon Canadian culture. So funding Canadian culture online is not an issue of mandating that ISPs have a certain amount of Canadian-based websites, but rather empowering Canadian entrepreneurs and Canadian artists to get out on the global market and carry that Canadian culture further.
They'd have to want to do that.
Well, they do.
And with the funding, perhaps, that would be the incentive. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And there are existing programs in place, whether private, like the Bell New Media Fund, or public, like the Canadian Arts Council, which do this work. But the issue is coherence and harmonizing all these programs. So instead of it being a scattergun approach, you have an actual agenda and you have an actual mandate to encourage Canadian culture. And again, whether it's the CRTC or the Canadian Heritage Ministry, the issue is not so much as whether it will happen, but how it will happen and who's going to pay for it.
When you encourage, though, Jesse, and I like the use of that word, do you then have to set some expectations of what that encouragement will bring? And therefore, that leads to enforcing those expectations. You know, I see a big challenge there.
Well, and I think part of that challenge is cultural, that the politicians and bureaucrats who are in power today didn't grow up with the internet, so they still sort of see it as an external force. But people of my generation generally understand that it is this wide open frontier, that if, for example, you could get a tax subsidy or a tax credit, that gives you more incentive to, say, create podcasts or to create Canadian-based internet content. That may occur anyway, but quite frankly, with the right type of government support, it doesn't have to be a lot of cost. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean every internet subscriber pays an extra $2 a month to fund Canadian culture, but rather we create...
Because people might get their backs up on that, right? Especially in these economic times. You want me to pay more?
And they already are. I mean, there are petitions online circulating saying keep the CRTC off the internet. But the reality is the government's already regulating the internet, and it should be coherent. It should make sense rather than be this sort of, you know, disparate approach in which no one really knows it's happening, and therefore we assume that it's a wild frontier when every country funds culture online and every country regulates the internet.
What about cell phone content?
Well, I think cell phone content is an issue that Canadians are concerned about, mainly the amount of money they have to pay for that content.
No kidding.
There is a lot of Canadian content available on mobile networks, but it's not accessible to Canadians. Let's imagine if those artists were subsidized, they wouldn't feel a need to charge people so much. Therefore, you'd have more free content on cell phones, and people would start using cell phones in the way that they are used in Asia and Europe that Canadians don't do because they can't afford it. So part of that is regulation, forcing the wireless companies to offer flat rate plans and to offer plans that are affordable to Canadians. But the other is to give incentive to content creators so they don't feel that they need to gouge us to get their return on investment back, but feel that they already have the type of environment where they can give this culture away free. Because that's the problem with the internet. How do you make money on culture? Right now, nobody really knows. So if we subsidize it, that allows artists not to worry about it and figure it out later, which would benefit Canada as a whole.
One other thing I want to bring up is the idea of perhaps dumping the system, coming in with a new system. I mean, there's a group of engineers in Stanford, as I understand it, who are working on, you know, a new vision for the internet. They're saying, you know, we've waited so long, we've let this thing grow so unwieldy, maybe it's time to go back to those building blocks. What have you heard about this new internet, if you will?
Well, I think it's inevitable. The issue will be how it relates to the old internet and whether it'll be a gated community that only certain people can afford, or whether it'll live up to the internet's true potential of being a universally accessible internet. It will come, and technically it's called IPv6, which is literally the next version of the internet protocol. But I think to take your question even further, maybe we should get rid of the CRTC. Maybe what we need is a Ministry of the Internet, which has the expertise to recognize that the internet affects economy, culture, politics, and as far as expertise within the civil service, we can't allow it to be within a small arm's-length bureaucracy that really has expertise in radio and television, but rather, like the Ministry of the Environment, have a whole ministry that empowers civil service to deal with the internet and all its risks, potential, promise, and peril.
On the one hand, though, you're saying the CRTC already mandates, already regulates, and has the authority to do so, and on the other hand, you're saying get rid of it.
Because part of the issue is legitimacy. I think most Canadians would look at the CRTC and see it as a top-down regulator. But if we had a Ministry of the Internet, it might be easier to frame that as a bottom-up agency that, rather than controlling the internet, facilitated the internet and encouraged internet use. That, I think, would be a little more palatable to Canadians who rightfully are a little wary of the idea of government regulation of such a free media.
Always good talking to you, Jesse. I'm glad you took the time to come in today.
Thanks, Suhana.
That's Jesse Hirsh joining us here in studio. And stay with us on CBC News Morning. Toronto, just wake it up. And if you're not already awake, come on, join us. Get up. Wakey, wakey, eggs and bacon. Colleen will be here with a look at the weather in your neighborhood. That's coming up in just a moment.